Hello, friends. Happy Tuesday. It's Tuesday, right? So, am I stupid? I think I know the answer to this. Am I stupid? For not realizing that quarantine means 40 days and 40 nights because quarant is French for 40. That's where it comes from. So Noah was in quarantine. As we get onto the trading passage, I'm not entirely sure I understand everything he's writing about. The first time in this book, like this far in, I've hit a passage where I'm just sort of saying the words and hoping for the best. I think what he's saying is that goods were not unloaded at some places, but other places would take them. But the captains of the ships had no right or permission to take those goods on, so they had to send back for permission to take the goods on. I think that's what's going on, but as the narrator says, I do not affirm it. Here was indeed one difficulty which I could never thoroughly get over to this time, and which there is but one way of answering that I know of, and it is this, viz., the first person that died of the plague was on December the 20th, or thereabouts, 1664, and in or about Longacre, whence the first person had the infection was generally said to be from a parcel of silks imported from Holland and first opened in that house. But after this, we heard no more of any person dying of the plague or of the distemper being in that place till the 9th of February, which was about 7 weeks after, and then one more was buried out of the same house. Then it was hushed, and we were perfectly easy as to the public for a great while, for there were no more entered in the weekly bill to be dead of the plague till the 22nd of April, when there was two more buried, not out of the same house, but out of the same street, and as near as I can remember, it was out of the next house to the first. This was 9 weeks asunder, and after this we had no more till a fortnight, and then it broke out in several streets and spread every way. Now the question seems to lie thus: where lay the seeds of the infection all this while? How came it to stop so long and not stop any longer? Either the distemper did not come immediately by contagion from body to body, or if it did, then a body may be capable to continue infected without the disease discovering itself many days, nay weeks together, even not a quarantine of days only, but soixantine. Not only 40 days, but 60 days or longer. It is true there was, as I observed at first, and is well known to many yet living, a very cold winter and long frost, which continued 3 months, and this, the doctors say, might check the infection. But then the learned must allow me to say that if, according to their notion, the disease was, as I may say, only frozen up, it would, like a frozen river, have returned to its usual force and current when it thawed, whereas the principal recess of this infection was from February to April, was after the frost was broken and the weather mild and warm. But there is another way of solving all this difficulty, which I think my own remembrance of the thing will supply, and that is, the fact is not granted. Namely, that there died none in those long intervals, viz. From the 20th of December to the 9th of February, and from thence to the 22nd of April. The weekly bills are the only evidence on the other side, and those bills were not of credit enough, at least with me, to support an hypothesis or determine a question of such importance as this. For it was our received opinion at that time, and I believe on very good grounds, that the fraud lay in the parish officers, searchers, and persons appointed to give account of the dead and what diseases they died of. And as people were very loath at first to have the neighbours believe their houses were infected, so they gave money to procure, or otherwise procured, the dead persons to be returned as dying of other distempers. And this I know was practised afterwards in many places. I believe I might say in all places where the distemper came, as will be seen by the vast increase of the numbers placed in the weekly bills under other articles of diseases during the time of the infection. For example, in the months of July and August, when the plague was coming on to its highest pitch, it was very ordinary to have from 1,000 to 1,200, nay, to almost 1,500 a week of other distempers. Not that the numbers of those distempers were really increased to such a degree, but the great number of families and houses where really the infection was obtained the favour to have their dead be returned of other distempers to prevent the shutting up their houses. For example, dead of other diseases, beside the plague, from the 18th of July to the 25th, 942, and then 1,004, and then 1,213, 1,439, 1,331, 1,394, 1,264, 1,056, 1,132, from the 19th to the 26th of August, 927. Now it was not doubted but the greatest part of these, or a great part of them, were dead of the plague, but the officers were prevailed with to return them as above, and the numbers of some particulars of distempers discovered it as follows. In total, from August the 1st to the 8th, 663, then 743, then 699, then 780, then 727, then 602, then 580, then 481. And there are several other articles which bore a proportion to these and which it is easy to perceive were increased on the same account, as aged, consumptions, vomitings, imposthumes, gripes, and the like, many of which were not doubted to be infected people. But as it was of the utmost consequence to families not to be known to be infected, if it was possible to avoid it, so they took all measures they could to have it not believed, and if any died in their houses, to get them returned to the examiners and by the searchers as having died of other distempers. This, I say, will account for the long interval which, as I have said, was between the dying of the first persons that were returned in the bill to be dead of the plague, and the time when the distemper spread openly and could not be concealed. Besides, the weekly bills themselves at that time evidently discover the truth, for while there was no mention of the plague, and no increase after it had been mentioned, yet it was apparent that there was an increase of those distempers which bordered nearest upon it. For example, there were 8, 12, 17 of the spotted fever in a week, when there were none or but very few of the plague, whereas before 1, 3, or 4 were the ordinary weekly numbers of that distemper. Likewise, as I observed before, the burials increased weekly in that particular parish and the parishes adjacent more than in any other parish, although there were none set down of the plague, all which tells us that the infection was handed on and the succession of the distemper really preserved, though it seemed to us at that time to be ceased and to come again in a manner surprising. It might be, also, that the infection might remain in other parts of the same parcel of goods which at first it came in, and which might not be perhaps opened, or at least not fully, or in the clothes of the first infected person, for I cannot think that anybody could be seized with the contagion in a fatal and mortal degree for 9 weeks together, and support his state of health so well as even not to discover it to themselves. Yet if it were so, the argument is the stronger in favour of what I am saying, namely, that the infection is retained in bodies apparently well and conveyed from them to those they converse with, while it is known to neither the one nor the other. Great were the confusions at that time upon this very account, and when people began to be convinced that the infection was received in this surprising manner from persons apparently well, they began to be exceeding shy and jealous of every one that came near them. Once on a public day, whether a Sabbath day or not, I do not remember, in Aldgate Church, in a pew full of people, on a sudden one fancied she smelt an ill smell. Immediately she fancies the plague was in the pew, whispers her notion or suspicion to the next, then rises and goes out of the pew. It immediately took with the next, and so to them all, and every one of them, and of the 2 or 3 adjoining pews, got up and went out of the church, nobody knowing what it was offended them, or from whom. This immediately filled everybody's mouths with one preparation or other, such as the old woman directed, and some perhaps as physicians directed, in order to prevent infection by the breath of others, insomuch that if we came to go into a church when it was anything full of people, there would be such a mixture of smells at the entrance that it was much more strong, though perhaps not so wholesome, than if you were going into an apothecary's or a druggist's shop. In a word, the whole church was like a smelling bottle. In one corner it was all perfumes, in another aromatics, balsamics, and variety of drugs and herbs, in another salts and spirits, as every one was furnished for their own preservation. Yet I observed that after people were possessed, as I have said, with the belief, or rather assurance, of the infection being thus carried on by persons apparently in health, the churches and meeting-houses were much thinner of people than at other times before that they used to be. For this is to be said of the people of London, that during the whole time of the pestilence the churches or meetings were never wholly shut up, nor did the people decline coming out to the public worship of God, except only in some parishes when the violence of the distemper was more particularly in that parish at that time, and even then no longer than it continued to be so. Indeed, nothing was more strange than to see with what courage the people went to the public service of God, even at that time when they were afraid to stir out of their own houses upon any other occasion. This, I mean, before the time of desperation, which I have mentioned already. This was a proof of the exceeding populousness of the city at the time of the infection, notwithstanding the great numbers that were gone into the country at the first alarm, and that fled out into the forests and woods when they were further terrified with the extraordinary increase of it. For when we came to see the crowds and throngs of people which appeared on the Sabbath days at the churches, and especially in those parts of the town where the plague was abated, or where it was not yet come to its height, it was amazing. But of this I shall speak again presently. I return in the meantime to the article of infecting one another at first, before people came to right notions of the infection and of infecting one another. People were only shy of those that were really sick, a man with a cap upon his head, or with clothes around his neck, which was the case of those that had swellings there. Such was indeed frightful. But when we saw a gentleman dressed, with his band on, and his gloves in his hand, his hat upon his head, and his hair combed, of such we had not the least apprehensions, and people conversed a great while freely, especially with their neighbours and such as they knew. But when the physicians assured us that the danger was as well from the sound, that is, the seemingly sound, as the sick, and that those people who thought themselves entirely free were oftentimes the most fatal, and that it came to be generally understood that people were sensible of it and of the reason of it, then I say they began to be jealous of everybody, and a vast number of people locked themselves up so as not to come abroad into any company at all, nor suffer any that had been abroad in promiscuous company to come into their houses or near them, at least not so near them as to be within the reach of the breath or of any smell from them. And when they were obliged to converse at a distance with strangers, they would always have preservatives in their mouths, and about their clothes to repel and keep off infection. It must be acknowledged that when people began to use these cautions, they were less exposed to danger, and the infection did not break into such houses so furiously as it did into others before, and thousands of families were preserved, speaking with due reserve to the direction of divine providence, by that means. But it was impossible to beat anything into the heads of the poor. They went on with the usual impetuosity of their tempers, full of outcries and lamentations when taken, but madly careless of themselves, foolhardy and obstinate while they were well. Where they could get employment, they pushed into any kind of business, the most dangerous and the most liable to infection, and if they were spoken to, their answer would be, "I must trust to God for that. If I am taken, then I am provided for, and there is an end of me," and the like. Or thus, "Why, what must I do? I can't starve. I had as good have the plague as perish for want. I have no work. What could I do? I must do this or beg." Suppose it was burying the dead, or attending the sick, or watching infected houses, which were all terrible hazards, but their tale was generally the same. It is true, necessity was a very justifiable, warrantable plea, and nothing could be better. But their way of talk was much the same where the necessities were not the same. This adventurous conduct of the poor was that which brought the plague among them in a most furious manner, and this, joined to the distress of their circumstances when taken, was the reason why they died so, by heaps. For I cannot say I could observe one jot of better husbandry among them, I mean the labouring poor, while they were all well and getting money, than there was before, but as lavish, as extravagant, and as thoughtless for tomorrow as ever, so that when they came to be taken sick, they were immediately in the utmost distress, as well for want as for sickness, as well for lack of food as lack of health. This misery of the poor I had many occasions to be an eye-witness of, and sometimes also of the charitable assistance that some pious people daily gave to such, sending them relief and supplies both of food, physic, and other help, as they found they wanted. And it is a debt of justice due to the temper of the people of that day to take notice here that not only great sums, very great sums of money were charitably sent to the Lord Mayor and Aldermen for the assistance and support of the poor distempered people, but the abundance of private people daily distributed large sums of money for their relief, and sent people about to inquire into the condition of particular distressed and visited families, and relieve them. Nay, some pious ladies were so transported with zeal in so good a work, and so confident in the protection of Providence in discharge of the great duty of charity, that they went about in person distributing alms to the poor, and even visiting poor families, though sick and infected, in their very houses, appointing nurses to attend those that wanted attending, and ordering apothecaries and surgeons, the first to supply them with drugs or plasters and such things as they wanted, and the last to lance and dress the swellings and tumours where such were wanting, giving their blessing to the poor in substantial relief to them, as well as hearty prayers for them. I will not undertake to say, as some do, that none of those charitable people were suffered to fall under the calamity itself, but this I may say, that I never knew any one of them that miscarried, which I mention for the encouragement of others in case of the like distress, and doubtless if they that give to the poor lend to the Lord, and he will repay them, those that hazard their lives to give to the poor and to comfort and assist the poor in such a misery as this, may hope to be protected in the work. Nor was this charity so extraordinarily eminent only in a few, but, for I cannot lightly quit this point, the charity of the rich, as well in the city and suburbs as from the country, was so great that, in a word, a prodigious number of people who must otherwise inevitably have perished for want as well as sickness were supported and subsisted by it. And though I could never, nor I believe anyone else, come to a full knowledge of what was so contributed, yet I do believe that, as I heard one say that was a critical observer of that part, there was not only many £1,000 contributed, but many £100,000 to the relief of the poor of this distressed, afflicted city. Nay, one man affirmed to me that he could reckon up above £100,000 a week, which was distributed by the churchwardens at the several parish vestries, by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen in the several wards and precincts, and by the particular direction of the court and of the justices, respectively, in the parts where they resided, over and above the private charity distributed by pious hands in the manner I speak of. And this continued for many weeks together. I confess this is a very great sum, but if it be true that there was distributed in the parish of Cripplegate only £17,800 in 1 week to the relief of the poor, as I heard reported, and which I really believe was true, the other may not be improbable. It was doubtless to be reckoned among the many signal good providences which attended this great city, and of which there were many other worth recording. I say, this was a very remarkable one, that it pleased God thus to move the hearts of the people in all parts of the kingdom so cheerfully to contribute to the relief and support of the poor at London, the good consequences of which were felt many ways, and particularly in preserving the lives and recovering the health of so many thousands, and keeping so many thousands of families from perishing and starving. And now I am talking of the merciful disposition of Providence in this time of calamity, I cannot but mention again, although I have spoken several times of it already on other accounts, I mean that of the progression of the distemper, how it began at one end of the town and proceeded gradually and slowly from one part to another, and like a dark cloud that passes over our heads, which as it thickens and overcasts the air at one end clears up at the other end, so while the plague went on raging from west to east, as it went forwards east, it abated in the west, by which means those parts of the town which were not seized, or who were left, and where it had spent its fury were, as it were, spared to help and assist the others. Whereas, had the distemper spread itself over the whole city and suburbs at once, raging in all places alike, as it has done in some places abroad, the whole body of the people must have been overwhelmed, and there would have died 20,000 a day, as they say they did at Naples, nor would the people have been able to have helped or assisted one another. For it must be observed that where the plague was in its full force, there indeed the people were very miserable, and the consternation was inexpressible. But a little before it reached even to that place, or presently after it was gone, they were quite another sort of people, and I cannot but acknowledge that there was too much of that common temper of mankind to be found among us at all that time, namely, to forget the deliverance when the danger is past. But I shall come to speak of that part again. It must not be forgot here to take some notice of the state of trade during the time of this common calamity, and this with respect to foreign trade, as also to our home trade. As to foreign trade, there needs little to be said. The trading nations of Europe were all afraid of us. No port of France, or Holland, or Spain, or Italy would admit our ships or correspond with us. Indeed, we stood on ill terms with the Dutch, and were in a furious war with them, but though in a bad condition to fight abroad, who had such dreadful enemies to struggle with at home. Our merchants were accordingly at a full stop. Their ships could go nowhere, that is to say, no place abroad. Their manufactures and merchandise, that is to say, of our growth, would not be touched abroad. They were as much afraid of our goods as they were of our people, and indeed they had reason, for our woolen manufactures are as retentive of infection as human bodies, and if packed up by persons infected, would receive the infection and be as dangerous to touch as a man would be that was infected. And therefore, when any English vessel arrived in foreign countries, if they did take the goods on shore, they always caused the bales to be opened and aired in places appointed for that purpose. But from London they would not suffer them to come into port, much less to unlade their goods, upon any terms whatever, and this strictness was especially used with them in Spain and Italy. In Turkey and the islands of the Arches, indeed, as they are called, as well as those belonging to the Turks as to the Venetians, they were not so very rigid. In the first there was no obstruction at all, and 4 ships which were then in the river loading for Italy, that is for Leghorn and Naples, being denied product, as they call it, went on to Turkey, and were freely admitted to unlade their cargo without any difficulty, only that when they arrived there some of the cargo was not fit for sale in that country, and other parts of it being consigned to merchants at Leghorn, the captains of the ships had no right nor any orders to dispose of the goods, so that great inconveniences followed to their merchants. But this was nothing but what the necessity of affairs required, and the merchants at Leghorn and Naples, having notice given them, sent again from thence to take care of the effects which were particularly consigned to those ports, and to bring back in other ships such as were improper for the markets at Smyrna and Scanderoon. The inconveniences in Spain and Portugal were still greater, for they would by no means suffer our ships, especially those from London, to come into any of their ports, much less to unlade. There was a report that one of our ships, having by stealth delivered her cargo, among which was some bales of English cloth, cotton, kerseys, and such like goods, the Spaniards caused all the goods to be burnt, and punished the men with death who were concerned in carrying them on shore. This, I believe, was in part true, though I do not affirm it, but it is not at all unlikely, seeing the danger was really very great, the infection being so violent in London. I heard likewise that the plague was carried into those countries by some of our ships, and particularly to the port of Faro in the kingdom of Algarve belonging to the King of Portugal, and that several persons died of it there, but it was not confirmed. On the other hand, though the Spaniards and Portuguese were so shy of us, it is most certain that the plague, as has been said, keeping at first much at that end of the town next Westminster, the merchandising part of the town, such as the city and the waterside, was perfectly sound, till at least the beginning of July, and the ships in the river till the beginning of August, for to the 1st of July there had died but 7 within the whole city, and but 60 within the liberties, but 1 in all the parishes of Stepney, Aldgate, and Whitechapel, and but 2 in the 8 parishes of Southwark. But it was the same thing abroad, for the bad news was gone over the whole world that the city of London was infected with the plague, and there was no inquiring there how the infection proceeded, or at which part of the town it was begun or was reached to. Besides, after it began to spread, it increased so fast, and the bills grew so high all on a sudden, that it was to no purpose to lessen the report of it, or endeavour to make the people abroad think it better than it was. The account which the weekly bills gave in was sufficient, and that there died 2,000 to 3,000 or 4,000 a week was sufficient to alarm the whole trading part of the world. And the following time, being so dreadful also in the very city itself, put the whole world, I say, upon their guard against it. You may be sure also that the report of these things lost nothing in the carriage. The plague was itself very terrible, and the distress of the people very great, as you may observe of what I have said. But the rumour was infinitely greater, and it must not be wondered that our friends abroad, as my brother's correspondents in particular were told there, namely in Portugal and Italy, where he chiefly traded, that in London there died 20,000 in a week, that the dead bodies lay unburied by heaps, that the living were not sufficient to bury the dead, or the sound to look after the sick, that all the kingdom was infected likewise, so that it was an universal malady such as was never heard of in those parts of the world, and they could hardly believe us when we gave them an account of how things really were, and how there was not above 1/10 part of the people dead, that there was 500,000 left there that lived all the time in the town, that now the people began to walk the streets again, and those who were fled to return, there was no miss of the usual throng of people in the streets, except as every family might miss their relations and neighbours and the like. I say they could not believe these things, and if inquiry were now to be made in Naples or in other cities on the coast of Italy, they would tell you that there was a dreadful infection in London so many years ago, in which, as above, there died 20,000 in a week, etc. Just as we have had it reported in London that there was a plague in the city of Naples in the year 1656, in which there died 20,000 people in a day, of which I have had very good satisfaction that it was utterly false. But these extravagant reports were very prejudicial to our trade, as well as unjust and injurious in themselves, for it was a long time after the plague was quite over before our trade could recover itself in those parts of the world. And the Flemings and Dutch, but especially the last, made very great advantages of it, having all the market to themselves, and even buying our manufactures in several parts of England where the plague was not, and carrying them to Holland and Flanders, and from thence transporting them to Spain and to Italy as if they had been of their own making. But they were detected sometimes and punished, that is to say, their goods confiscated, and ships also. For if it was true that our manufactures as well as our people were infected, and that it was dangerous to touch or to open and receive the smell of them, then those people ran the hazard by that clandestine trade not only of carrying the contagion into their own country, but also of infecting the nations to whom they traded with those goods, which, considering how many lives might be lost in consequence of such an action, must be a trade that no men of conscience could suffer themselves to be concerned in. I do not take upon me to say that any harm was done, I mean of that kind, by those people, but I doubt I need not make any such proviso in the case of our own country. For either by our people of London, or by the commerce which made the conversing with all sorts of people in every country and of every considerable town necessary, I say, by this means the plague was first or last spread all over the kingdom, as well in London as in all the cities and great towns, especially in the trading manufacturing towns and seaports, so that first or last, all the considerable places in England were visited, more or less, and the Kingdom of Ireland in some places, but not so universally. How it fared with the people in Scotland I had no opportunity to inquire. Fine. Well, that's where I'll stop for today on page 227. Yesterday's video is there. Tomorrow's when it's up will go there. Also, Dad's jigsaw puzzle arrived today. Praha! I hope you're all doing tremendously. Thank you for watching. Tip jars at the bottom as well. Thank you for everything. Bye-bye.